us the point printed on the Sichos also that when it comes to the difficulties that led up and the suffering that the Frierdiker Rebbe endured during his incarceration, that the Frierdiker Rebbe took on himself. And the Rebbe makes the point that there are certain mitzvahs that are done through the Melech. Every year has to be mekayim all of Taryag mitzvahs, but since there are some mitzvahs that are done by the Melech, and not all of us are malachim, we're surely not going to be. So the Melech is a neshama klolis, the Melech is moitzi all of Klal Yisrael. And to that degree, the Frierdiker Rebbe was moitzi everyone with all the difficulties. But then when it comes to the celebration, when it comes to the Geula, when it comes to the freedom, there the Frierdiker Rebbe says, Loi oisi bivad gal, and he wants all of Klal Yisrael to participate in the Geula. So nowadays, it's a very uncertain time. Many of us feel unsure. Schools are in, schools are out. We can't go to shul, we can't go to shul. It's going up, it's going down. Simon Tzad, Gesund, Tzai, Bana, Chaya, Lezena. It's very uncertain times. And sometimes we can feel very unsure. So a good base Tamuz is a nice time to come together and we anchor ourselves in what we know is Teda and Kedusha and the Rebbe's perspective. But many times when we feel very uncertain, very conflicted, unsure, particularly as fathers in the home, that we have to project and give our children some chayas, some focus, some certainty. So Yud Beis Tamuz is a special opportunity to celebrate gratitude, feel the kedusha, the greatness of the Rebbe gave us. In Russia, in those times, they went into the battle without seeing the end, without seeing that they're going to come out alive at the other end. They went into it, but with the certainty as they definitely done. So what anchored was the conviction that this is richtig, this is what the Rebbe wants, and the koiches, the brachas of the Rebbe. This gives us focus on the certainty to go weiter. That Yud Beis Tamuz. So Rabbi Paltiel is here, so we don't have to give any many introductions. Everyone knows Rabbi Paltiel. I think Rabbi Paltiel also came personally to Manchester. I don't think he Farbrengens the Beis Menachem in Manchester. I think he was more in South Manchester. So it's wonderful that one of the things that come out, unfortunately, such a virus is that we're able to have access in ways that we couldn't have had before. Or easier to get access to all these wonderful Chassidisha Yidden that can Farbrengens with us and help us be in touch with this Yom Zbula, the special day of Yud Beis Tamuz. So L'chaim, L'chaim. Thank you very much, Rabbi Paltiel, for your time. Thank you for the Chanaim Bacon from Ton, the doing now, and Bachal, all the wonderful things that you do. And it should be Svadus Pi'ilias as well as Thomas Medatul. L'chaim, L'chaim.
Alhamdulillah. From the Gula Shleima, this is the Rika Kolaikim. It's kind of funny to tell a Chaim that if I bring it like this, I usually drink water. I happen to have a little wine in my hand. Chaim Levracha. By you it's evening. By me it's still afternoon. One of the Simanim of Ashikid as I drink patog, right? So Chaim, everybody, Chaim Levracha. Thank you for having me. And the Ebi should bless us all with all the brachas. This is a Yom Segula. And it's an opportunity to ask the Ebi for all the brachas that we need. And all of us. We have many needs, and on top of that, we have the need that we don't know how to manage our needs, which makes our needs much more acute. So the Eibusha should be Malam Mishalis, in all things. And I think we've all come to the absolute conclusion that anything short of Mashiach Tzidkenu B'Pel Mamish, it doesn't even suffice as a band-aid for us to have life. Physically, I don't know, maybe we can survive. But in terms of our neshama, in terms of our lebedikait, we all need the gula shlima b'teva nirav nigla. Yud Beis Tammuz is a geula, right? Yud Beis Tammuz is a geula. It's a chaga geula. The Rebbe used to bring the Rashi and Masechta Megillah that Shem geula chadu. They're all geulas are connected. It is a connection between every geula and every other geula because the constant, the nekuda, the essence of a geula is that it is something that comes from on high. If you learn this from Yetzias Mitzrayim, that when the Jewish people were redeemed, were released from Mitzrayim, from exile, from Egypt, the difficulty was not getting Egypt out of the way. Hashem could have very easily addressed the problem of the Egyptians, of the Mitzrayim, disposed of them in many different means, methods, to take away the Jewish people's master. But taking away somebody's master doesn't make somebody free. It just makes somebody directionless. The Eibush had to give Yidden freedom. And that's a very deep thing. To take away a master for the Eibush, there's a kleinikuns. To take a person who's a slave in his mind and in his heart and in his soul and give him freedom is an inyan pnimi. So the Rebbe Chassidus explains that the Rashi says in Megillah, whenever there's a geula, that's what it means. Geula doesn't mean you remove an incarcerator. Geula doesn't mean you unlock a jail cell. Geula means you give freedom. And freedom comes from the Eibishter. Freedom is not what the world thinks freedom means. You know, the world thinks freedom means I can do whatever I want. But the fact of life is that people who are able to do whatever they want find themselves enslaved to many of the things that they thought they were accessing with complete liberty and freedom, whether it's excessive food or it's excessive drink or it's excessive drugs or it's excessive preoccupation with anything that's not really important. To be free means to own yourself. That's what it means to be free. To be free means, this is how I tell it to my students, to tell yourself to do something and to listen 100% of the time. To tell yourself to do something and to listen 100% of the time. That's a free person. To tell yourself not to do something and to never do it. That's a free person. If I tell myself to do something and I cannot do it, if I tell myself to stop a bad behavior and I cannot stop myself, I'm a slave. And freedom means not to be a slave. And for this, we learn in Hasidus that freedom is not taking away a master, or removing a chain or a lock or a door or a wall. It's being free. And that's why Hasidus says, that Rashi says, Shem Gula Chadu, every redemption is the same. It's Hashem giving a koach for freedom. So if all gulas are the same, then Yud Beis Tammuz is a gula and Mashiach is a gula and all the gulas are connected. And it would really be wonderful if we say the Gula Shlema today. You're already in the evening hours, but I understand that the mile of living in England is that the Yom Tovim lasts a couple of hours longer. It's nimshach with 10 of us. It's like Tamuz Farbrengens noch in Manchester. L'chaim v'lebracha, l'chaim tevim l'shalom, l'chaim v'lebracha to all the Yiddish kinder, l'chaim. Okay, here's what I want to share, at least to start, yeah. You know, we learn Hasidus from an early age. And as time passes, the children are taught Hasidus at earlier and earlier ages. When I was going to yeshiva, they started teaching Hasidus later. Now the kids learn earlier and they learn more. We can debate whether it's right or wrong, but I have a very strong suspicion that the Rebbe believes the earlier and the more the better. The Rebbe doesn't mind younger children learning more Hasidus because the Rebbe has a better understanding of how desperate the times we're living in and therefore the need for as much oil, as much light, as much lichtigkeit as possible, even though we may not necessarily see the fruit directly. But we learn Hasidus from a very, very early age. And then as we live life, we don't only learn Hasidus, we begin to observe it. We begin to see it in the world. We begin to see the place that Hasidus has in our lives based on the way we live. We live in Ilm Hazeh. We live in this real world, in quotations. Real is in quotation. And the longer we live, the more we see the Divrei Elokim Chayim component of Hasidus, that Hasidus is life. And I think one of the things we learn as we age, at least that's how it is with me, is every day that passes in our life, it makes more sense to us, not just how important the tzaddik is, the Rebbe, the tzaddik, but how in truth everything is the tzaddik. Everything that happens in this world that's positive can be traced to the tzaddik. The world has its own direction. And the direction of the world, like it says in Tanya, based on Kabbalah, is not good. The direction of the world is lazy. The direction of the world is heavy. The direction of the world is, to be simplistic and general, evil. The direction of the world is dark. And the Eibishter puts tzaddikim in this world. And they are, to use a fancy expression, atzmiyim. Atzmiyim means they draw their energy from inside of themselves. They don't draw energy from their environment. They're not vulnerable or susceptible to the influences of what's happening outside of themselves. They draw all the energy from inside of themselves. And they shine light. That's what a tzaddik does. That's what a Rebbe does. He shines a light. And the light that the tzaddik shines lifts. Some people it lifts a lot. 100%, 90%. Some people it lifts very little, 5%, 1%, 0.5%. But how much the light of a tzaddik lifts each of us, the tzaddik hoiped. That's what tzaddikim do. They lift, they raise us up. The Frierdiker Rebbe was a tzaddik. Tzaddik was a Rebbe. And for reasons that are known only to Atzmos of Hussein Zal Baruch Hu, for reasons only to the Eibishter, the Frierdiker Rebbe was gifted. The Frierdiker Rebbe was left to shepherd one of the most difficult periods in the history of the Jewish people. One of the most difficult periods in the history of the Jewish people. The Rebbe Rayatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, was the tzaddik who had to carry us through. Just say 1920 to 1950. Just say those numbers and think what happened in those 30 years between 1920 and 1950, and you have a little bit of a sense of the burden, the achrayus that the Rebbe carried, the Frierdiker Rebbe carried, shepherding Klal Yisrael through one of the darkest periods in the history of the Jewish people ever experienced. I'll tell you a ma'aseh from Polish tzaddikim, but the emes tzaddikim. The Frierdiker Rebbe had a contemporary who was an incredibly holy man. He was born the same year as the Frierdiker Rebbe, but he lived 7 years longer than the Frierdiker Rebbe because his father lived 7 years longer than the Rebbe Rashab. The Baron of Belz, the Hilike Belzer of the Baron of Belzer. His father passed away the same year that Rebbe Rayatz went out of jail, 1927, Tafresh Pei Zayin. And in the Belzer Hasidic group, the custom is that by the Levaya they announce succession, by the funeral they announce who the next Rebbe is, and they actually give him Mazel Tov. This is their culture, their tradition. So by the Levaya of Rabbi Yisachar Doiv of Belz, the Hasidim announced who the next Rebbe was going to be, and they gave him Mazel Tov. And Abba Belzer stood at the open grave of his father and he cried and he said, Tate, Vosar Adoras de Megalost. What kind of generation did you leave for me? The Frierdiker Rebbe was left to shepherd, to Rebbe, one of the most difficult generations the Jewish people ever experienced. Like Yirmiyah Navi says, like Jeremiah says, the Pasuk says in Sefer Eicha, Ani hagever ra oni b'sheve basemi. Yirmiyah Navi was the Rebbe, was the tzaddik, carrying the Yidden from before the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash until a substantial amount of time after the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash. And he had to shepherd, he had to shine light to this incredibly dark time and to an incredibly pained generation. That in addition to all of the other nisyonis and tzaris that they experienced, they also experienced extraordinary change. Their world was very, very dynamic, in constant flux. It was a new world. And whenever there's change, there's a sakana. Whenever there's change, things are precarious and uncertain, and there's risk, there's dangers, even physically and certainly spiritually. And the Rebbe Rayatz, this was his opinion. You know that it says that when the Bolsheviks in 1920, in the winter of 1920, the Bolsheviks finally came to Rostov. Right? If you're familiar with the history, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution, started in November 1917 in Leningrad. Leningrad is in the Baltic Sea, which is near the top of the world. Yeah, it's pretty close to your neck of the woods. And Rostov is on the River Don, which is very far south. And there was a terrible civil war that took place all over Russia, where there were 2 camps or 3 camps fighting, competing for dominance in Russia at the time. And of course, they all had one common enemy, which is the Jew. And they all did their share in making life impossible for the Jewish people. And in 1920, which was a little bit more than 2 years later, they finally came into Rostov. When they came into Rostov, the Rebbe Rashab commented, the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe's father, said, Ich kann mit sie nicht sein in einem. I cannot cohabit with them. I can't live with them. And it's quite clear that the Rebbe Rashab made a conscious decision to, as they say in yeshiva language, to check out and to leave this test for his son. And there's, by the way, there's an exact story with the Mittler Rebbe. When the Cantonists started, the Mittler Rebbe said, Ich kann das nicht, I can't do this. He went to his father's tziyun in Hadich, and he came out and he said, the Tat hat mir abgesagt from the Rabbonos. My father has redeemed me from the Rabbonos, and of course the Mittler Rebbe was nostalgic, he passed away. And the Tzemach Tzedek had to deal with that test. So it seems a very similar story with the Rebbe Rashab. He made the conscious decision that he's not going to deal with the Bolsheviks. And there's a famous story how there was a very, very, very dramatic Tamuz Farbrengens, which was on a Thursday night, where the Rebbe Rashab expressed incredible disregard to the whole communist system, and he spoke about them in ways that could have gotten him into an enormous amount of trouble. Sunday after that Purim, he started writing his will. It took him a week to write his will. The will of the Rebbe Rashab has never been seen, but it's known to be incredibly scholarly, very learned, very scholarly will. The next Friday night, he got sick, and the Motzei Shabbos after that, it was nostalgic. You read the story, and there's a very, very, there's almost an hour by hour account of that story. You see that this man wrote his own ticket. He decided he had enough, and he had enough. And the Frierdiker Rebbe became a Malim, became Kotche, the Frierdiker Rebbe did. And as the Rebbe would say, the Frierdiker Rebbe had to reinvent himself 3 times. The Frierdiker Rebbe had to make himself into a new person 3 times over. The first time this happened was in Russia itself. I told you a minute ago that the Rebbe Nishmas Eidus, the Rebbe Rashab's will, has never been seen. The Rebbe Rashab's will was very long. It's in the Rebbe's library, I understand. And it's very, very, very scholarly. And it's about halachas of Yerusha. Even though the Rebbe Rayatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, was an only son, how complicated could the laws of inheritance be with exactly one heir? But the Rebbe Nishmas Eidus' will is very scholarly. The previous Rebbe publicized 1 page of that will, 1 page of that will, where the Rebbe Rashab gives the Frierdiker Rebbe instructions about what he should do. And in short, what it says on that 1 page is that the Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe's father, wrote to the Frierdiker Rebbe that he wants him to continue all the things that he is doing, which is to say Chassidus to Chassidim, to be Makam people to Yechidus, to strengthen the Moised HaKodesh, to maintain and to expand the Moised HaKodesh, and also to continue the various projects that had started after the First World War about people learning Chassidus. All over Russia there was a renewed interest in learning Chassidus, and Rabbi Paltiel and the Rabbeim were very involved. So the Frierdiker Rebbe became a Rebbe under a certain pretense, under a certain assumption that he's going to continue the work of his father. Within a year or 2, Russia began to come to pieces. The Soviets went into every single city. And of course, you know the tragedy of it. The tragedy of it is that it wasn't Goyim. It was the Yevsektia, right? Yevsektia means the Evreiska section, the section of Jews who were ardent, who were religious, who were fanatic communists. Many of them were former Yeshiva Bacharim, big Talmidei Chacham in some cases, who now had become very angry with Torah and with Yiddishkeit, and they went around uprooting any bastion, any establishment, any security in terms of the continuity of Torah mitzvahs all over Russia. And the Gedolim left Russia by their hundreds. Russia had the biggest yeshivas and the biggest goinim and the greatest Rashi yeshivas and the greatest rabbanim in the world. And they left. They just ran away. And the Frierdiker Rebbe realized that there was this huge vacuum, that everyone had just, in his words, run away from the front, abandoned the front. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, I was appointed to be a Rebbe, not to be a Malamed for little kids. I was appointed to be a Rebbe, not to engage with worrying about mikveh tare and Shabbos and the basics of Yiddishkeit. He said, but I saw that all with length and breadth of Russia, there was this huge escape, and there was a vacuum. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews, millions of Jews abandoned. And the Frierdiker Rebbe undertook an endeavor, a project, which is really monumental. Besides for the dangers involved, it was incredibly large. The first thing he did was he sent spies. He sent people around for reconnaissance. He sent around Rabbi Tzvi and Shem Tov, who was well known to Manchester, and also a chassid by the name of Rav Simcha Gorodetsky. They were young bacharim at the time, to visit every city of Jews all over Russia and to come back and report what they saw and what they heard. And then the Rebbe began to stopgap. He sent his people to take over the Rabbaniyos, to take over the Shechita, and take over the Malamdis all over Russia. The Frierdiker Rebbe set up an incredibly large network of Moistes Torah and Hasidus and Yerushalayim all over Russia. The Frierdiker Rebbe was an amazingly organized man, incredibly organized man, and he kept track. They have now documents printed where you see hundreds of Chadarim in different cities all over Russia, with the number of students in each cheder and the names of the teachers that the Frierdiker Rebbe was personally supporting. And I must tell you that much of the money, or all of the money that Rebbe Rayatz had access to do this incredibly monumental project, was American money. It came from America. There was a Jew who lived in Moscow, whose name was Dr. Rosen. He was an American Jew, he was a member of the Joint. And him and the Frierdiker Rebbe used to have meetings, and they would negotiate how much money the Rebbe needed, and they provided the Rebbe the resources. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't waste a dime. But he created an unbelievable network of Torah and Hasidus and Chinuch, and he defied the Russians. He defied Lenin, he defied Stalin in a real way. And he set up this incredibly organized and expansive web, I guess that's the right word, a web of Torah and Yerushalayim, and it wasn't about Hasidus at all. It was about Shabbos, Kosher, Mikveh, Chinuch. Those were the big things. And I guess you could say that the thing that stands out, that we all remember and talk about most, was the Tineke Shel Beis Rabban, the Mesiras Nefesh that the Frierdiker Rebbe had to teach that children should learn in Cheder. And of course, the Soviets were well aware of this, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was mamish, was a hair in the ointment, as they say, and they didn't know how to deal with the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe would not compromise. And the Frierdiker Rebbe stood for absolute Mesiras Nefesh. He stood for absolute uncompromising Mesiras Nefesh. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't at all thinking about his safety. It never crossed his mind. He was thinking about the perpetuation of Yiddishkeit with a reckless disregard for his own life. And he sent his Hasidim into such places. Many of them were sent to Siberia, and then in the later period, in the 30s, when the Rebbe Rayatz was in Russia, if you sent you away to Siberia, you usually came home. But in the 30s, the mid-30s, the late 30s, they would just take you and shoot you, Rahman al-Islam. And there's so many Hasidim whose names we know and whose names we don't know that they pushed and arrested them. And within a few days, they were in Elam Emes. And the Frierdiker Rebbe organized an incredible network of Chinuch and Moistes Torah all over Russia. And the Russians, they were looking for an excuse to get him, as it were. And there are two things, I think, that I'm going to mention, at least, that sort of set up the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest. The first is the meeting of Rabbonim in a city called Karastin. The story briefly is that the Soviets the government organized the meeting of Rabbonim. And they got many of the very prominent Rabbonim in Russia, some of them were Gedolim, were Goinim, Amitim, like the Leningrad Rav, Harav Katznellenberg, and he was a Litvish Yid. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes about him with such reverence, such respect, even though Harav Katznellenbergen was very angry at the Frierdiker Rebbe, because Harav Katznellenbergen did not understand why the Frierdiker Rebbe was doing what he was doing. He didn't understand the dangers, and he felt that the Frierdiker Rebbe was threatening his position. And there was a huge meeting of Rabbanim organized by the government of Russia, and the Frierdiker Rebbe came out officially against it. And he organized a counter Asifa of Rabbanim in the summer of 1926, the summer of Tafresh Pevov. And everybody knew that act of defiance was the nail in the coffin. Everybody knew that decision was going to be the last straw. The Soviets were not going to ignore this chutzpah, this defiance, this arrogance, and that the Rebbe Rayatz would be punished for it. Everybody knew it. And the Frierdiker Rebbe knew it quite well. And the Frierdiker Rebbe saw it through because he felt that it had to be done. And there's a lot of details about that meeting. Much has been published and written about that meeting. And a lot of the Rabbanim in Russia, not necessarily Hasidim, but if they were a little bit understanding of politics and how the Soviets operated, knew that the Frierdiker Rebbe was correct and this had to take place. Now, just to give a little bit of drama to the story, that Rosh Hashanah, Tafresh Pei Zayin, Rosh Hashanah 1926-27, the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Leningrad, and the Frierdiker Rebbe blew shofar, as was the tradition in Chabad. The Rabbeim either blew shofar, or at least they were mesadedish. In other words, some of the Rabbeim didn't actually blow the shofar, but they would make the brachas and they would say the psukim. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, that Rosh Hashanah, when he was mesader the tchiyas, so you're supposed to, if you're familiar with our machzor, you start Lam Natzeach, Livnei Keirach Mizmah. We begin tchiyas shofar with Psalm 47, Kapitel Mem Zayin. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe began to speak, he cried out, I Sertza Lamatzech. Sertza, I don't speak Russian, so I may be mispronouncing the word, but many of my Russian Talmidim have told me, and Talmidim, Sertza means heart, my love. He cried out, Lamatzech, I Sertza Lamatzech. And Hasidim knew that 85 years earlier, the Tzemach Tzedek in Tafresh Gimel, when he had his story of Mesiras Nefesh, also cried out before the Tkiyas, I said to Lamatzech. And the Hasidim understood that this year was going to be a difficult year. The Frierdiker Rebbe said at one point, For Tafresh Pei Zayin habe ich sich stark geschrocken. For the year Tafresh Pei Zayin, I was very, very afraid. It was an Iber year, it was a leap year. And it's known that leap years are hard years. Traditionally, leap years are hard years. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, For Tafresh Pei Zayin habe ich sich stark geschrocken. For the year 1927, I was very, very afraid. Getracht habe ich nicht wegen sich. I wasn't thinking about myself. Ich habe sich gesorgt sehr wegen Hasidim. He said, I was very afraid what would be with Hasidim. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't know clear what was going to be. He just knew that something was up. And of course, the hemshech to that story is that Rosh Hashanah, Tafresh Pei Zayin, the Frierdiker Rebbe said a Maimer Chassidus, which is in print, but you can't find this part of the Maimer from what I know. And in the middle of the Maimer of Rosh Hashanah, Tafresh Pei Zayin, he started to speak about Hashgacha Pratis according to Shittas Baal Shem Tov. He started to speak about the Baal Shem Tov's philosophy of Hashgacha Pratis, that everything is precise, even in Datzach. There's no accidents. Everything is exact. But of course, if you follow the Baal Shem Tov's philosophy of Hashgacha Pratis, you also follow that you can't possibly understand the Hashgacha completely. Because that's what it means. If you follow the Baal Shem Tov Shita and Hashgacha is something which is completely above reason. And later on, the Frierdiker Rebbe would say that if not, and it wasn't planned, he had not intended on speaking about Hashgacha Pratis in the Rosh Hashanah Maimer. It came to him as he was speaking. In other words, the Rebbe Rayatz had prepared to say a Maimer. He had prepared it, and he looked up the notes. However, a Rebbe prepares a Maimer Chassidus. And this inyan of Hashgacha was not part of what he had planned to say. As Satzach Geret, it came by itself. And he said later that if not for the fact that the Rosh Hashanah Maimer Tafresh Pei Zayin, he had spoken about Hashgacha Pratis, felt that nicht ewige the arrest. He wouldn't be able to survive his incarceration. And the Rebbe once explained it as a look at the Sichas actually, because by saying this idea, the Frierdiker Rebbe was accepting that even when something happens that doesn't make any sense, al pi Torah, it's also by Hashgacha Pratis. Anyway, this was Rosh Hashanah. And of course, the next event that happened that year, which is worth noting, happened Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah, the Frierdiker Rebbe introduced Tilim of Chitas. Right? We say Chitas. Chumash Tilim Tanya. I don't know exactly when Chumash started. Tanya, we know. Tanya was started. The Takon of saying Tanya was introduced when the Rebbe, our Rebbe, the Rebbe Zogazun made the Hayoim Yoim. The Frierdiker Rebbe, they actually showed pages. The Rebbe used to write the Hayoim in his own handwriting, the entry of Hayoim Yoim, and it would say the date, Shiyurim, Chumash, Tilim, and then Tanya, and he would leave an empty space, and the Frierdiker Rebbe in his Heiliger handwriting would write in the Shir of Tanya. And there's actually facsimiles that are printed in some of the Hayyim Yom where you can see this, how the Rebbe wrote out the Hayyim Yom and he left an empty space, and the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote in the Shurim of Chitas, of Tanya. So that started in 1943, 42, 43. Tilim started Pezayim. It started the year of the Rebbe's arrest. And the Balchaim asked, so the Frierdiker Rebbe said to the Balchaim Altis, when he was already released from prison, when he was in Kasrama, he says, Fatofresh Pezayim habe ich sich stark geschrocken. For the year 1927, I was very afraid. Bis ich habe gebeten sagen, Tilim is mir angekommen sehr schwer. Till I asked that Hasidim should say Tilim, I had a very hard time. So the Balchaim didn't remember. The Balchaim said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, when? So the Frierdiker Rebbe told him Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah of that year, there was a Kiddush in the Frierdiker Rebbe's mother's apartment, and there, or a room, I don't know, whatever the case was, and during that Farbrengens, the Frierdiker Rebbe said he wants people to say Tilim. When the Frierdiker was arrested, they ransacked the house. When the Frierdiker was arrested, they ransacked the house. The ransacking of the house was done to look for supposedly documents that they wanted, but it was primarily done for the purposes of antagonizing and intimidating and humiliating. It was done to unsettle a person. When the Frierdiker was taken away and his entire office had been turned upside down, he had in his office a stender. And on the stender was a piece of paper. A piece of paper is written in pencil, and it begins with the word Hert Yidden was Gleiben in Mashiach. That's how it started. Listen, Jews who believe in Mashiach. And the whole, it's a few lines. It's printed in the back of the Tilim. It's printed in the back of our Tilim. You can see it inside. I'm not saying it verbatim. He says, Chsidim Heisich. Und Stam Yidden better. Chsidim, I'm commanding. Stam Yidden, I'm asking. That with Adinyan of Abbas Yisrael, they should say every day a Shir Tilim. That was Simchas Torah, that Yitafresh Peizayin. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said that the Tilim that people said helped him a lot. And just Terech Agav, to tell you something about Halacha Minik, when the Frierdiker Rebbe made the takon of saying Tilim originally, he said that after Aleinu, they should say Kaddish, and the Chazan should walk away from the Ummet, and to go over to the Bimis HaKriya, and to say Chitas Tilim. So it shouldn't be like a Haisaf on Tefillah. You probably didn't know this. This is not very well known. When the Frierdiker Rebbe originally made the takon of Tilim, he said that after Aleinu, the Chazan should go away from the Ummet, go to a different place in the Shul, so it shouldn't be like they're adding on to the Siddur. This was for 1 year. After 1 year, the Frierdiker Rebbe said that you could already say Tilim Behemshech. It became a part of the davening, a Hemshech to the Tefillah. This was Simchas Torah Tafresh Pei Zayin. Now, during the year, there was a lot of things that were going on that were very, very unpleasant, or unsettling, disturbing. One of the most famous ones, of course, is the Frierdiker Rebbe's visit to Moscow, Purim Cotton, and the Maimeh V'Kibul HaYehudim, which we know as the Maimeh Ve'ata Tetzaveh. It's the same Maimeh, right? The Frierdiker Rebbe said a Maimeh V'Kibul HaYehudim, and in Perek Gimel, he begins, Yesh Lahagdim Tchila Mashe Kosa Ve'ata Tetzaveh. The Rebbe turned it around. He started off Ve'ata Tetzaveh, and in Perek Gimel, he mentions V'Kibul HaYehudim. Perek Dalet, he mentions V'Kibul HaYehudim from the Frierdiker Rebbe, which was a Maimeh about children, And V'Yelim V'Yenki V'Sad Te'ez, L'Hashma Seivim L'Snakim. The koyach the children have. He mentioned the Medrash on Mordechai who spoke to the children, and he told Haman Arasha that the Besura Teva Bisrani, the famous Utzu Eitz Altira Pachapisim, Utzu Eitza and Altira Vadzikna. This was Purim Cotton. Purim Gadol, the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Leningrad. Purim of 1927, the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Leningrad, and there was a Farbrengens, and Hasidim came. And on the one hand, it was an incredibly dark and dangerous time. But on the other hand, the mood of Mesiras Nefesh, the Frierdiker Rebbe, had raised up the Hasidim, not one or two, hundreds, to a mindset of Mesiras Nefesh. Rabbi say it's impossible for us to understand what it means to eat Mesiras Nefesh for breakfast, lunch, and supper, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, whatever you call it in Manchester. But the Anash, Chassidim, and Stam Yidden in Russia, the Frierdiker Rebbe rallied them for Mesiras Nefesh to give everything, the last drop of blood for Yiddishkeit in the Soviet Union, and we'll never know until Mashiach comes how many Tmimim and the children of Tmimim paid the ultimate price to do the work of the Frierdiker Rebbe. We know the names of some, and we know the stories of even less. But the degree of Mesiras Nefesh that the Frierdiker Rebbe inspired in his Chassidim is unbelievable. So on the one hand, it was a very dark time. On the other hand, it was an incredibly heightened time. These were people, when you're that awake, when you're that dedicated, I don't want to use the word exhilarating, but that's exactly what it is. It's exhilarating. I was at a Farbrengen, and I was standing next to the Mendel for the fast, and I heard him say, he didn't say it to the whole crowd, but he muttered it to himself, but loud enough for the people around him to hear. The Mendel for the fast sat in jail for 10 years, close to 10 years. And I heard him mutter to himself, as Beintzach Mesiras Nefesh. I miss it. I miss Mesiras Nefesh. How could any human being Beintzach noch Mesiras Nefesh? It's very difficult to understand. But that was the mood. There was an energy of dedication. They had a task. And the task required to have no considerations, no rational considerations, no limitations, and how they proceeded in doing everything they could to teach children Torah, and to keep the makvayos open, and the rabbonim, and the shchita, and the shuls, and anything which had to do with Torah mitzvahs, and kasher and matzah for Pesach, and the list goes on and on. So the Farbrengen of Purim, and everybody knew what was happening. Everybody understood that the Frierdiker Rebbe had crossed the last line with the Soviets, and there was nothing holding them back. In other words, the decision that the Frierdiker Rebbe had earned, he pushed the envelope so far that it was only a question of time before they would come and get him. Everybody understood this, and the Frierdiker Rebbe understood it very well. And there was a feierdik Farbrengen that put him. And there's a letter for the Frierdiker Rebbe where he describes that Farbrengen and put him. And amongst the things he writes was that he doesn't even remember everything that he said, and that later, Sipruli, he says, people told me what he said. And amongst the most poignant moments of that Farbrengen and Purim was that at one point he stood up and he pulled open his shirt and he pointed at his bare chest and he said, "As if it's as der Guf brennt, sollte nicht aufhören lernen mit Tashpar." Friedrich Rebbe said, "If you see this body burning, do not stop learning with the children." This was the mood. This was the condition. You understand? Now, just stamazei hamaise, I'm telling you a story that I don't know the details of, and I forgot even from whom I heard it. I didn't hear the story from my father-in-law, but my father-in-law was a Moshe Nemenov, a Nissan son. I didn't hear it from him, but I heard that Reb Nissan itself, Reb Nissan Nemenov was in Leningrad then in 1927, and he heard. However, he knew it. He was still a bocher b'stameh, but he was very choshev. But the Frierdiker Rebbe Reb Nissan Nemenov was very choshev, and again, I didn't hear this from my father-in-law, but I heard from other people that Reb Nissan said that a little while, but before the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested, he called in our Rebbe, who was not yet his son-in-law. He was a chasna, Yudli is chasna, the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe the following: I want to ask you a shaila in halacha. And the shaila in halacha had to do with how we should behave in prison, because he may be in a place where there's not so much sneers, and there may be a latrine, not proper smells and so on. And he asked the Rebbe, Shaila, how you're supposed to behave as far as davening goes. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said to the Rebbe, I want you to know that your psak is not negei l'maisa. What you're going to tell me is not going to matter to me. Because I'm going to be meiseh nefesh, I'm going to sacrifice my life till the last drop. I'm not compromising at all. Ich will nur sehen wie a Hasidischer Rav. I want to know how a Hasidischer Rav, how a Rav who has a background in Hasidus thinks about the Shaila. That's what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. And then, of course, he was arrested as Vavsim. Now, in Das Tachten, there's a simple reason why he was arrested as Vavsim. Because someplace in Western Europe, maybe in France, a communist party member, a prominent communist living in one of the Western countries was murdered. And the Soviet government decided to teach the world who they are. That night, they arrested 20 clergy people, lahav adults, not just Yidden, also Goyim, and they shot them. They arrested a whole bunch of people, they brought them into the prison, and by morning they were dead. Very prominent men. The Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested with a whole bunch of others. What was the nest with the Frierdiker Rebbe? Again, there's a lot of details to the story, but the Nukud as a Sefer was, the Frierdiker Rebbe was told to go into a certain room, but they didn't tell him what time he has to get there. They didn't tell him be there by 6:15. Let him get to that room. So we sat down on the bench to smoke a cigarette. Verstehst? The Frierdiker Rebbe sat down, and he was supposed to go to a room. Had he walked through that door, he would not have come out. He sat down to smoke a cigarette. And by the way, the Frierdiker Rebbe said that the whole 18 and a half days that he was in Russian prison, in the Shpalerke prison, his father was with him every second. So maybe his father suggested that he should smoke a cigarette. However it came out, he sat down on a bench, and while he was smoking, somebody walked out of an office and recognized him and asked him why he was there and where he was going. And when he told him he was going to room 60, I think that was the number, he was very aghast. He couldn't believe it. And that was the end of it. The Gzeira was immediately rescinded. It was a nef, golem and hashamayim. He spent 18 and a half days in the Spaleka prison. And you should know, they beat him makas retzach. They broke his goof. The Bechlal wardens, prison people, love to break their prisoners. This is their great pleasure, to break their prisoners. And if the prisoner doesn't break, they do things to hurt them until they crack them. Yeah, the Frierdiker Rebbe you couldn't break, so they beat up on his goof. They beat up on his goof so many times, hoping that by you beat a person enough times, you break the body, you break the spirit. But the Frierdiker Rebbe's goof was breakable, unfortunately. But the Frierdiker Rebbe's spirit was unbreakable. And for 18 and a half days, he went through severe beatings, not once or twice, many times. Some of them he describes in the Meshimas HaMaaseh. A lot of them we don't even know. They beat him repeatedly, but they couldn't break his spirit. It was not possible to break the Frierdiker Rebbe's spirit. Just one of the stories that the Rebbe told, that Thursday was the Shchedish. Tamuz has 2 days of Shchedish. Thursday was the first day of Shchedish Tamuz. They came into the Frierdiker Rebbe's cell, and they told the Frierdiker Rebbe that he should stand up, Stelzach. Because the rule in the Russian prisons were that whenever you got an official word, you had to stand up. So he told the Frierdiker Rebbe to stand up, and the Frierdiker Rebbe said, the Frierdiker Rebbe had certain policies that he had made for himself. One of them is, he never looked in the eye, he always looked down. He wouldn't talk to them and look at them. He refused to talk Russian, although he spoke a very fluent Russian. He spoke Dafke in Yiddish, and they had to have a translator when there was necessary. They came, and he wouldn't show them any honor, any deference. So they walked into his cell, and they told him to stand up. And the Rebbe said, I'm not standing up. And they told him that this is the policy in the prison, that whenever they give you an official word, you have to stand out of respect. And the Rebbe said, I'm not standing. And they told him, either the first time or the second time, that we want to give you a verleichterung. We want to give you good news about the lightening of your sentence. And the Rebbe said, I'm not going to get up. So they told him, we'll beat you. So he says, well, so you'll hit me. And they beat him. They didn't beat him. They beat him like they know how to beat. And they left. They came back a while later, and they told him again, Stelzach, to stand up a second time. He refused. And they told him again, if you're not going to stand, we're going to hit you. So he says, they hit him again. And they left the second time. When they came the third time, they told him to come into the office. They didn't tell him to stand up. But naturally, if he's going to go to the office, he had to get up to go to the office. So he was already standing, and they told him the pshuta that they're letting him leave the prison. He's going to go into exile instead of sit in prison. And they told him that he could go home for 6 hours, and then either using his own money he could travel, however he could afford to travel, or using the government accommodations, he had to get to Kastamar by a certain time. So the Frierdiker Rebbe asked if he's going to have to travel on Shabbos, and they told him yes. And the Rebbe said, I'm staying in jail, I'm not going. So first of all, there was a whole shiloh, they would let him stay in jail. And second of all, once the decision, because the government said, that's fine, the Rebbe explained that this act of staying in jail for another 48 hours was a terribly reckless act of Mesiras Nefesh. It was an incredibly reckless act of Mesiras Nefesh, because they used to say in Russia, they say it everywhere, but especially in Russia, accidents happen. Mistakes, accidents. In the Soviet prisons, accidents could have happened. Anyway, and he spent 2 more days in jail, and he left on Sunday, which was, of course, Gimel Tamuz. And you all know this story, that he went home. He gave specific instructions that no one should come to this train station to see him off. He came to the train station, and there were thousands of Yidden, there were thousands of nobodies who would come. The Rebbe said nobody should come to the train station, so thousands of nobodies showed up at the train station. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, when I saw the crowd, I said to myself, I cannot be silent. He was the engine of Mesiras Nefesh. He was the force. He was the life. He was the light, the energy behind all the Mesiras Nefesh that people were having in Russia. So he stepped forward on the platform, and he said the short Sikha, which is printed. The Rebbe would refer to it as a Maimer, and he oftentimes would say Maimarim based on this Sikha, which begins with the pasuk, Yehi Hashem Elokeinu Imanu, Kasher Hoyim Aveseinu Al Yazveinu Al Yacheinu. The Eibush should be with us like he was with our parents. And he told the story of the Tzemach Tzedek that I mentioned before, how the Tzemach Tzedek had Mesiras Nefesh. And he said that Hashem should be with us like he was with our Zaydas. And of course, the quotable quote, there's so many quotable quotes from that page, from that Sikha, but one of them is that the Frierdiker Rebbe said, Nit mit unser Willen sind wir gegangen in Golus, nit mit unser Willen wollen wir herausgehen von Golus, not by our choice that we go into Golus, not by our choice that we're going to leave the Golus. God Baruch Hu hat uns verschickt in Golus. And this is not precise. Und Shir Malchus übergegeben, Hashem gave us into exile and to be dominated by other nations. Aber das darf in alle Völker, asher al pnei ha'adama wissen gewiss. This has to be known by all the nations of the world on the face of the earth. Nor unsere Gufes, then übergegeben geworden in Golus. Und verschickt Shir Malchus, again, whatever the quote is directly, only our body was exiled and given over to the dominance of the nations. And when it comes to the Yiddish Neshama, sagen wir mit der 1000-jährigen jüdischen Stolz, Altigu bim Shichai und Biei Alterei. When it comes to the Neshama, we say to the Goy, in the Goyishkeit, it's none of your business. This is not your department. Don't make sin. It's none of your business. This is what the Frierdiker Rebbe said. And of course, he went off to his exile. This was on Sunday. He probably arrived there on Tuesday. And of course, once a week, he had to report. Once a week, he had to announce himself that he was there. And the beginning of the work week, well, I understand that the beginning of the work week was Wednesday. So let's say he arrived on Tuesday. So Tuesday, he went to the office of the KGB and he reported. The next day, Wednesday, which would have been the beginning of the new work week, he went again to report. And he was told, come back next Wednesday and tell us that you're here. They haven't left the city. The Frierdiker Rebbe stayed in the house of a shoichet. Someone just told me that there's an article which described in one of the magazines how this shoichet was soon after arrested and sent away because he hosted the Frierdiker Rebbe. Because I saw a sikha from our Rebbe where the Rebbe says that one of the big miracles of Yud Beis Tammuz is that nobody who helped the Frierdiker Rebbe in any way, shape, or form, during his arrest paid any price. The Rebbe said that one of the miracles of Yud Beis Tammuz, where there were so many people who did things to help the Frierdiker Rebbe, not one of them was punished for it. And so this was something, whatever. Someone just told me that there's such an article. I didn't see it myself. Someone told it to me. He was by the Sheikh. And he took a walk. It was Tuesday, Yud Beis Tammuz. Yud Beis Tammuz, of course, is the Frierdiker Rebbe's birthday. And he met an official from the office. They told him that today the offices are closed. It's a chage. He says, you'll have to come tomorrow morning, but you should know that a cable came from Moscow that we should let you go. So Tuesday, Yud Beis Tammuz, the Frierdiker Rebbe was informed that he's free to go. And the way the Rebbe told the story, the Rebbe L'chaim started to turn white and red. Half a face was white. The Frierdiker was afraid that he was going to implode. He had to bang him on his back to bring him back to himself. This was Tuesday. Wednesday morning, which was the beginning of the work week, he went to officially report, and they told him that he's free to go, and he left. He went back home. He arrived on Friday, which is Tezvav Tammuz, the 15th day of the month of Tammuz, which is why the Rebbe would often say that Yud Beis Tammuz is a Yom Tov, and Yud Gimel Tammuz is a Yom Tov, and Tezvav Tammuz is a Yom Tov. That's the day that the Rebbe came home. Of course, the end of the story is that shortly thereafter he left Leningrad, very shortly left, and he hid away in a suburb of Moscow called Malachovka. Now, to know fully why the Rebbe did this, you have to be the Rebbe. But the way it's understood by Hasidim is, and there's a lot of aspects to this, the Frierdiker Rebbe realized that the whole of Russia was now the prison. He was the only free person. That means they would not touch him. The Frierdiker Rebbe was a sacred cow. They couldn't touch him. But anybody who came to see him was put in jail. So they just turned the prison inside out. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe was the nerve center. He was the head of a movement that was incredibly wide. I described it before as a web. It's exactly what it was. All over Russia, wherever there were communities of Jews, there was underground activities that Frierdiker Rebbe was supporting, certainly with his word and with his wisdom, and in many cases, possibly with his wallet also. And the Rebbe realized that now they were not going to touch him, but they were going to make it impossible for him to communicate, to be involved. And then he decided, so he disappeared for a long time. He was hiding in Malachovka. He wouldn't let anybody come next to him. He was very, very careful not to risk his own life and the life of the people who would come in contact with him. And he spent the whole summer figuring out what he wanted to do. The story is that for Tezvav Elul, that year, which was the birthday of Yeshiva's Tem Chetmimim, the Rebbe Rayatz took a very dangerous trip all the way to Rostov, which is the other end of Russia. And he was Mishtateach al Kever Aviv. He was by the Tzion of the Rebbe Rashab in Rostov. And he came out and he said that Tatat M'Yigeb M'Rishus Arois Tzeforim. My father gave me permission to leave the country, and he went right back to Leningrad. And now he went public. He announced everybody could come. And there was a Sturm Deke Tishrei. Tishrei Tafresh Beches was very freilach. There were many, many people who had never seen the Rebbe before and would never see him again. They saw him only that Tishrei. Many people, thousands of people, hundreds of how many people. I mean, if you've ever been to the Rebbe Friedrich's house in Leningrad, you'll realize there wasn't exactly room for millions of people, but they say thousands of people came for that Tishrei to Friedrich and Rebbe. A Sturm Deke Tishrei. And of course, the Friedrich and Rebbe left right after Simchas Torah. So what I want to say is this, that the Simchas Torah, the day before he left, the Friedrich Rebbe said, he made a statement, and he asked that the statement should be misparsim. He asked that they should make sure that everybody hears it. And the statement was that there are people who think that his departure from Russia has to do with a threat, or with fear, or intimidation. And the Rebbe says, Dvorim she'ein ha'seichel seivlosam klal. Things that don't make any sense. What the Rebbe was saying is, if you know me, you know I'm not frightened. I'm not leaving out of fear. Why am I leaving the country? This is a direct quote. Seidem is Suder Yeshkan. There's a master plan. Seidem is Suder Yeshkan. There's a master plan. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe did not see his departure from Russia as a departure. The Frierdiker Rebbe saw his departure from Russia as a moving to another step. Now, I started to tell you in the beginning how the Frierdiker Rebbe had to reinvent himself again and again. He came out of Russia. He settled in Western Europe, in Riga, Latvia, and he lived there for about 6 years. The entire time that he lived in Riga, Latvia, his stationery, the Frierdiker Rebbe's personal stationery, said his name, and there was an address. And it said in Hebrew and in Latvian, whatever language that is, temporary residence. The entire time he lived in Latvia, the Frierdiker Rebbe was not decided where he wanted to be. And he traveled all over. He was in Israel, he was in America, he was in many countries in Western Europe, he was in many countries in Eastern Europe. The Frierdiker Rebbe was doing reconnaissance. There's a better word, but it's not coming to me now. He was checking out the landscape, deciding where he wanted to settle. And eventually he decided that he wanted to be in Poland. The day after the Frierdiker Rebbe became a Latvian citizen, he moved to Poland. And that's what saved his life when the war came, which is a discussion for another time. And he wrote a letter to our Rebbe, which is printed in Igros Kodesh now. When the Frierdiker Rebbe made the decision to leave Latvia, move to Poland, he said, when I sit by myself and I contemplate, I say the only thing I want is I want to be in a Makom Torah. So he moved to Poland. First he was in Warsaw, and then he had to leave Warsaw. He moved to Otwock, which is a suburb of Warsaw. And those few years, 1934, 35, 36, 38, 39, were the closest in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Nesias to what Lubavitch had been. He went back to being, in effect, an old Lubavitcher Rebbe, involved with Avodah Primis and Chassidus and Avodah Satfilo, and people who were worried about such lofty things as Bidur Amidis and Iskafia. And the Lubavitch took over Poland. The Temch Tmimim in Poland was incredibly effective and successful. The best Bachar of all the yeshivas joined Temch Tmimim. It was an incredibly successful period. And then the war came. Now, for purposes of full disclosure, the Frierdiker Rebbe's decision to come to America had been made in 1938. He had already decided to leave Poland before the war had started. And he had put in papers for immigration, and that made it a little bit easier for him when the war started for the State Department to allow him to come to the United States. They came to America. The Frierdiker Rebbe describes in a Sikha in 1946, Tafshin Vav. He says, imagine being 60 years old, broken in body and spirit, and starting your life over again like a child. It's the Frierdiker Rebbe's own words. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not want to be in America. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not like America. He didn't like the American mentality. He didn't like American showiness. He didn't like American phoniness. But the Frierdiker Rebbe said about Americans, they're very easy to inspire, and they just as easily cool off. And he referred to his period in America as the Hashgacha HaElyonah Shlichus, as the Shlichus of the divine hand. In other words, by no means was it his choice. The Frierdiker Rebbe came to America because the Eibishter brought him here, against his wishes, almost al pi adibu. And of course, he sat on a ship for 9 days, crossing the Atlantic. And during those 9 days, he was in deep meditation. And he was asking himself a shaila, I'm a Rebbe. A Rebbe leads. What am I going to do when I get to America? Now the Anash, the Chassidim, even his family, were thinking the Frierdiker Rebbe is an elderly man. His health is compromised. He'll come to America and they'll take him to a suburb of New York, to a nice little place. And he'll sort of retire. And he'll have a nice house with trees and grass. And people will travel up from New York City to see the Rebbe. And they'll leave checks, and they'll get brachas, and there'll be Farbrengens, and there'll be alle gute Sachen, maybe even Temch Tmimim. But the idea was that the Frierdiker Rebbe would be away from the tumult of New York, and he'd be able to relax, learn, daven, serve the Eibishter as he wished, without worrying about the outside world. And that's why, the first Pesach, the Frierdiker Rebbe came, the first Pesach, he went to Lakewood. I don't know if he went to Lakewood, they took him to Lakewood. But the purpose of his going to Lakewood was they were hoping that he would settle in Lakewood, which was a suburb. It wasn't part of the tumult of New York City. And the Frierdiker Rebbe chose to settle in Crown Heights. Why Crown Heights? Because Crown Heights was the center of the world. It was the center of Brooklyn, and Brooklyn was the center of New York, and New York was the center of the world. The Frierdiker Rebbe made the decision to be right in the middle of all the tumult. His Chassidim couldn't afford to live near him. The real estate was too expensive. And he wanted to be in the center of the action. Because the Frierdiker Rebbe made the decision that he's not retiring. I came to America, to machen von America, mokum Teda. He said, I came to the United States of America to make America into a place of Teda. This was his mission. And he wanted that America should be a mokum Teda, as even den alten heim, like it was in the old country. Not that people learn in daven, but with the mentality that existed in Europe. And the mentality that existed in Europe is that all there is Yiddishkeit. American Jews, unfortunately, were very caught up in this disease that in America you have to be an American. You can be from, you can learn Torah, but you have to be an American. You have to be like everybody else. You have to be normal. And this clip of being an American, even if practically you were 1,000% from, it ate at your soul. Because the American values were values of melting, of assimilating, of being worldly. And the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't just want people should learn in daven. He wanted people should learn in daven as wie in der alten heim, where they did it in the old country. And the Rebbe once said to somebody, I heard this from good sources, that the Rebbe des Schwert gewollt machen Amerika von Amokum Tere, und hat es nicht sicher gewesen zu sein. The Frierdiker Rebbe wanted America to Amokum Tere. He himself didn't merit to see it. Aber ich bin ja solche das zu sehen. The Rebbe says, I have the chus to see American Jews who don't think about how to balance being a Jew with being an American, because there's no two values, only one. A Yid, Torah Tmima. This is what the Frierdiker wanted to make out of America. And it's quite reasonable to say, and you could bring a number of different proofs for this, more than one number, that Yud Beis Tammuz is not just the day that the Frierdiker Rebbe's life was saved. Yud Beis Tammuz is the first step, or the second step, or the third step of what would bring the Rebbe to the New World, to the New World, yeah, New York, and New London, and New Britain, as opposed to Old York and Old London and Old Britain, right? And from the Chatzi Kader Atachten, from the lower half of the world, from this part of the world, where it says in the Sikha, in the Frierdiker Rebbe's letter, in the Sikha, Kayochel Matan Teda didn't happen on a level of Gilui. It will be the source of Yiddishkeit for the entire world, and that's how it's been now. Now it's 80 years. It's 80 years since the Frierdiker came to the United States of America. And this is the Yom Tov of Yud Beis Tammuz. The Yom Tov of Yud Beis Tammuz, it celebrates Mesiras Nefesh, no doubt about it. And it celebrates a Nes Golui, an unbelievable Nes. I've been saying this a lot. I don't know if I'm supposed to say it or I've been allowed to say it, but I believe it. When the Frierdiker Rebbe walked out of the Shpalerka prison, when the Frierdiker Rebbe walked out of that jail cell, on that Sunday, Gimel Tammuz, the person most surprised was himself. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not have an exit strategy. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't go to jail with a plan of how he's getting out. The Frierdiker Rebbe went to Mesiras Nefesh, let the chips fall when they may. This was his attitude. This was his shtel. The Frierdiker Rebbe led from the front. The Mesiras Nefesh that he demanded of others, he practiced himself 1,000-fold. It was a Nes Min HaShamayim that he survived. And that's why he made a Yom Tov. When the Frierdiker Rebbe made Yud Beis Tammuz into a Yom Tov, he said, because I didn't do this, the Eibusher did this. I did everything in my power to give my life away for the Eibusher, and the Eibusher kept me. The Eibusher preserved me. And that's the Yom Tov. And that's why he said, like Rabbi Cohen said in the beginning, that Yud Beis Tammuz, Lo Yosi Bilvad Go HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yud Beis Tammuz, the Eibusher did not only redeem me on Yud Beis Tammuz, Ala Kol Mechav V'Teinu Mitzvah, all those who love Teinu Mitzvah, Ad Asher B'Shem Yisrael Yechunah. Even such people whose entire identity as a Jew is that B'Shem Yisrael Yechunah, that they identify as a Jew as a secondary name. We were all redeemed Yud Beis Tammuz. Like I said in the beginning, we live from the Rebbe. Every Yid, every Chassid lives from his connection to the Rebbe. It goes without saying. A Rebbe shines a light and lifts us up. And the Yom Tov of Yud Beis Tammuz is in a way, I can't say this for sure, but in a way, it's the beginning of the new world, right? That would really fully emerge after the Second World War, where Jewish people would be thrust into modern countries, to modern cities, and the challenges of being Frume Hasidish Yidden in cities like New York and in London and in Manchester, where for so long, Frum Jews, Haredi Jews lived in Shtetlach. In Shtetlach, it was not difficult to be a Frum Jew because there was nothing going on. Even if you wanted to sin, it wasn't with what. And this is the challenge of Seizman Agolus, that the Rebbe, of course, it says in the Rambam, that the Gemara says that the Rambam brings it, that one of the things that happens when Mashiach comes is that we do tshuva. We are the tshuva generation. That's what we're the generation of Mashiach. We, all of us, even those of us who think that we're Greisa Hasidim and we come from Greisa Hasidim, we are the tshuva generation. And this is why we have a Farbrengens in Yud Beis Tammuz. It's not because once upon a time we given a nes. We have a Farbrengens in Yud Beis Tammuz because Yud Beis Tammuz speaks to us. And our avodas Hashem. And of course, the point is, I get paid to make speeches. I'll be candid. I get paid to make speeches. The important thing is that there should be a hazozah, that the point of having a Chassidish Farbrengens at any time is that you tell a story and you hope the story uplifts and it pushes us in a certain direction. And if there's anything that Yud Beis Tammuz teach us, or the Rebbe teaches us, or the Frierdiker Rebbe taught, what's Mesiras Nefesh? What's Mesiras Nefesh in Manchester? What's Mesiras Nefesh in New York? What's Mesiras Nefesh? When the Frierdiker Rebbe turned 15, on his 15th birthday, the Rebbe Shab took him to the oil. Yeah, he took him to the oil. They were away from Lubavitch. They made a special trip on that Tuesday. He took him to the oil. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said to his father, why are we coming on Tuesdays? Our tradition was to always come on Monday. And the day before, they had already been in Lubavitch and he had left. And he told the Frierdiker Rebbe, at Verten, he told the Frierdiker Rebbe, ich nehme dich zu an Akeda. Avram Avinu took Yitzchak Avinu to the Akeda when he was 37 years old. The Rebbe Rashab took the Frierdiker Rebbe to Akeda when he was 15 years old. He took him into the Oilim, and he said to him, I'm making with you an Akeda, I make you a Knesset Bris, a covenant, And he told him that from that day on, he was going to be his right-hand man in all matters of Askanos Tziburis. The Frierdiker Rebbe became a public person at the age of 15. And for the next 55 years of his life, he was a servant of the Jewish people with total and absolute Mesiras Nefesh. But on that date, on his 15th birthday, the Rebbe Rashab, his father, said to him that for Askanos Tziburis darf man haben Mesiras Nefesh. That to be a leader of Jewish people, to speak, to be an activist on behalf of the Jewish people, you have to have Mesiras Nefesh. And he said to him, "Du weißt was Mesiras Nefesh means." You know what Mesiras Nefesh means? Azoya nitandish. Azoya nitandish means the way of Torah is the only way. And there isn't an option, there isn't a negotiation, there isn't a possibility. The values of the Rebbe, the values of Hasidus, which are Torah Tmima and Emunah Tehoira, and Taras HaKodesh, that we don't live in two worlds. We're Jews, and that's it. This is one of the lessons of his Tamuz. I'll tell you, Tamuz when they arrested the Frierdiker Rebbe, so they came into his house. It was 2:30 in the morning, and they made a mess. They made a lot of noise. They woke people up. It was very, very disturbed. So one of the things the Frierdiker Rebbe described is they went into the room of his two unmarried daughters. The Rebbe had 3 daughters. One was married. Her name was Chana. She was married to the Rashad. She also lived in the house. And then there were 2 other daughters. One was the Rebbe Mushka. She had a younger sister who was unfortunately later killed by the Nazis. Her name was Rabbanus Hatzakonos Shendel. Her name is written on the Matzeva. On the Rebbetz's Matzeva, her name is written Shendel. And they went into the room of the 2 girls, and they asked them, are they members of the party? Now the Rebbe Mushka characteristically had nothing to say. So Shendel said, no, we're not members of the party. Farvos, why aren't you members of the party? So Shendel screamed at them. And she said to them, Farvos is nicht the IRAC. It me gefragt sich, wenn ich bin Scheich zum Partei, you asked me about the party, I told you no. Why? It's none of your business. Why? And then she said, Ich belong zum Tatenspartei. I belong to the party of my father. This is the story. And the Frierdiker Rebbe tells it in his Rishimas Amais. What's the pshat? The pshat is at any time and any place, there's the party that everybody belongs to. There's the party that's popular and accepted and mainstream and considered normal, considered reasonable, considered right. And then there's the Partei von Taten, there's the party of the father, of the Rebbe, part of the Eibishter. That party is very old. And it's been losing elections for thousands of years. But it's still here. And when you're distracted and you say, I don't want to belong to the losing team, you understand? I want to be part of the winners. And you sell your soul or a part of your soul or a sliver of your soul to belong to some other party, you don't know yet the full consequence of it. And the Rebbe teaches, Astodem Tatens Partei, there's the party of the Rebbe, there's the party of the Eibishter, which means Torah Tmima. It's not Teirim Derecheretz, it's not Teira Umada. And it's Taras HaKodesh. It's Yiddishkeit with full Amunah and full B'tochen and full Tar and full Kedusha. This is what we celebrate in Yebis Tamuz. This is what we Farbrengens about. We talk about Yebis Tamuz. So the Eibishter should help us all that we should revisit those values, which are our values. And we should strengthen our commitment, even in action, in the direction that keeps us belonging to the Rebbe's Partei. And the Chaim Levracha, the Eibishter will help him, and the Zaychas line to the Gula Shleima, and the Shtay and Admasai, and the Eibishter will head in the Gishrei, man soll rausgehen von den Bitten in Gottes, weil there's no other truth, it's eine andere Sache. Okay, L'chaim al Yiddish Kinder. Okay, L'chaim, nice to see you all. And please visit InsideChasidus.org. Please, InsideChasidus.org, InsideChasidus.org. Please visit. I can talk to you until, like he said, you can go to sleep and you can wake up and I'm still talking. L'chaim, L'chaim.
L'chaim, Rabbi Paltiel, thank you very much for bringing. We have with us Rabbi Chitrik from Tzvas. Rabbi Chitrik is one of the shluchim that the Rebbe sent Tavshalam Zayin, correct, to Yisrael. And he made the very famous seminary, Beis Hana, in Tavsham Mem, I think. So it's already 40 years that he's making the seminary. Countless Jewish homes were built. Siddish Isaac Gestalt from his chinuch. Personally, I also benefited from that on a number of fronts. So we're very grateful that Rabbi Hitler can be here with us and join the Farbrengen. Rabbi Hitler, gives your camera on.
Yeah.
Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Hitler.
Aleichem Shalom, dat is met Chaim, die is Tamuz.
I think the closest you got to Manchester, maybe besides your Sved, your son being in Manchester. You ever in Manchester, Rabbi Hitler?
I Farbrengen, I was there for Shabbos.
Let's forget. Rabbi Paltiel was there for Shabbos. I forgot that you were there.
Was for Shabbos. I was there several times before. L'chaim. Baruch atah l'Pilei Melech HaMibreg Over.
Tamuz Farbrengens.
Zicher, for sure.
Okay. So we'll have it played in, electronic tonight.
Oh yeah, I go it. Yeah, we have everything's made automatic.